Hello, everyone, and Happy New Year. I'm back today with a video on my 10 favorite books from last year. There was a single unifying thread throughout all of these books, which ended up being from a variety of different genres, written by men, written by women, but there was a theme that I felt kept coming up: women, violence, and disappearing. The intersection of those three things and how violence affects women and leads to their disappearance, both literally them disappearing out of this world and no one knows what happened to them, or in a more metaphorical sense, the erasure of women from society. We're gonna look at these books through that lens. There's like 2 books in this list that don't really fit into that, but I found it really interesting that this kept coming up in all of these books. And again, I didn't make this list with this in mind. It was something that came up after I made the list. Certainly wasn't thinking of this while I was reading, but I just think it's really interesting. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I've missed being on YouTube, and I hope you enjoy. And let me know in the comments down below how your year of reading went in 2025, what your top 10 favorite books were, if there was anything similar to me where this theme kept coming up in your reading that you weren't necessarily looking for, but looking back now on your reading and retrospectively, you can notice some kind of pattern or thread that unifies all of your favorite reads. The first book that I want to talk about is the last book that I finished in 2025, and that is 2666 by Roberto Bolano. And when I say this was the last book I read in 2025, I was literally rushing to finish this at like 11:50 on New Year's Eve. I will say that despite it being a really long book, I actually think this was very accessible in terms of its writing. Because it's broken up into parts, it doesn't feel like a super long book. It felt more like I was reading 5 different novels. And I think part of that might be why it took me so long to read it, because after I finished one part, I kind of went and read other things, came back to the book. But this ended up being one of my favorite books of all time, honestly. And 2666 definitely is an incredible novel, and like I said, it is divided into 5 parts. The first part, the part about the critics, it almost leads you astray, because I went into this book expecting this really gritty crime drama, and the first part, the part about the critics, is actually this really quaint story about these 4 literary critics who are obsessed with this writer, Benno von Archamboldi. And you're reading this and it's really enjoyable and it's really funny and sort of quaint how they live their lives. They're professors, and so they have these very comfortable livelihoods. They go out to restaurants, on conferences, and they eat delicious food, and they drink wine, and they talk about literature. They just have this really beautiful life, and you're sort of wondering, like, why is this in a book about the murders of dozens of women in this fictional city set in Mexico? Like, why are we following these 4 European literary critics? That was a sort of a question I had in my mind when I was reading part 1, but at the same time, I just enjoyed their rapport and their friendship so much. And then as their friendship develops and you sort of start to see the cracks in their friendship a little bit and see the dynamics, it's very, very comedic. And I think in general, I think 2666 is a really absurdly humorous book in a way that I wasn't expecting going into it. Just to say a little bit of why I picked this up, I kept seeing this book everywhere. It sort of came to a head when I was watching a interview with Lauren Groff, who is also on this list. Later on we'll see her, but Lauren Groff was talking about 2666, and I literally, after watching that interview, I went to Barnes & Noble and I bought the book, because I was like, this is just too much, like, it's being mentioned way too much for me not to pick it up immediately. And it wasn't like part of my plan. It was such a long book. It ended up taking me so long. It sort of derailed my reading in some ways, because I mentioned in a previous video that I really wanted to hit 52 books, and then reading such a big, chunky novel really put a damper on that, but I have no regrets because this was such a fantastic book, and hearing Lauren Groff talk about it is really what pushed me over the edge into wanting to read it. I am not going to talk about it in any specific terms here because I really, really want to do a spoiler discussion on all my thoughts about this book. It is about women, violence, and disappearing. That is a central theme of this book, but it is also about colonialism. In Mexico, there are these maquiladoras where women who work there are working class, and those women are primarily the victims of violent crimes. And how these maquiladoras, it's really interesting how they bear the names of these European, Japanese, American names in Mexico City, and how those names contrast with the names of the streets and the neighborhoods where these women live that are primarily being targeted by this violent serial killer that exists in Santa Teresa. And just in general, I think that this book is an inversion of the classic serial killer trope where you focus more on the serial killer and less on the victims. I think that this book really turns that on its head. And yeah, I just don't want to say too much about this book because I think part of the joy question mark, I think I did get a lot of joy out of reading this book, to be fair. But yeah, part of the experience of reading this book, I think, is starting part one being like, why are we talking about these random European literary critics? What do they have to do with these murders? And then getting into the rhythm of the different parts and sort of circling around this central horrible gaping thing that is happening in Santa Teresa, and then coming to a conclusion. And yeah, this was an incredible novel to experience, and definitely one of the best books I've ever read in my life. I highly recommend, with lots of trigger warnings, obviously, given the content of this book. So I mentioned Lauren Groff. This was the book that I read that had me looking up her interviews and wanting to hear her speak about her work, because I just love this book. It is a survival story about a young girl who escapes from the Jamestown colony in what would become Virginia. It's in the middle of winter, and she decides that she is going to attempt a journey all the way to Quebec. Like, she has no resources, nothing but her wits and a pair of boots that she stole, like a coat, and that's it. Groff's writing is so fantastic in this. She is just a searing writer. It is a really short book that is about faith, again, about the disappearance of this one girl and the violence that she saw in Jamestown, the violence that she experiences in the wild, how that differs from the violence that she experienced in civilization versus the violence that she experiences in the wilderness, striking out on her own. And then again, just how I think one of the messages of this book is how civilization can be so specifically violent against women. She experiences that following her as she escapes. She is so afraid of that following her. That's like the number one villain in this book, is civilization following her. And there's a really fantastic scene in this book that I think really encapsulates what I'm talking about. And Groff just has a beautiful way of writing, is a meditation on faith as well, and God and her relationship with God as she is attempting this escape from Jamestown. Grateful to Lauren Groff for putting me on to Roberto Bolano. The next book, I also read the last 3 books of the Neapolitan novels by Elena Ferrante in 2025, and I got my fiance this wonderful edition of all of the books together in one volume. It is pretty crazy. This was my gift to my fiance for Christmas, and it is just this absolutely insane edition of all 4 books bound together. Quite beautiful, I have to say. Incredible. And I do have to say that I really love this color scheme that they chose to depict Ischia in, because it is very sort of somber, and it's not like a happy beach experience, because these books are, again, fall into that thread of women, violence, and disappearing. First book, My Brilliant Friend, opens up with the revelation that Leinu's best friend, Leela, has disappeared. Her son comes around and tells her that he hasn't heard from his mother, and she has just upped and vanished. And then you go back in time and you meet Lenu and Leela as little girls. I read My Brilliant Friend last year, and I will say I read it before the New York Times list came out, and I was surprised to see it on there as their favorite book of the century. That was surprising to me. But once I read the rest of the series this year, I understand why they did that. I understand why it's there. I understand why it's at that very top spot, because this series is just incredible in the way that it charts Lenu's life and Leela's life, and how we learn of the violence in Naples and the way that it affects their life, and the way that these two girls are affected by the violence of Naples so differently, until at the end you sort of know that Leela is going to disappear, and that's always sort of looming. Again, I can't go into spoilers for the last book, but this theme of disappearance comes up quite a lot, and it is a central theme of these books. I also think it's quite interesting to think of the Naples that is depicted in Elena Ferrante's books to Santa Teresa in Bolaño's work, and how these are sort of reflections of these different kinds of violence and how it shows up in different areas of the world. I think that the last 3 books are absolutely brilliant, and they make so many of the details in book 1. They make those details make sense, and I've said this before about Ferrante, but the way that she plants these small things, like Lenu's silver bracelet comes up in book 1, that silver bracelet comes up again and again in ways that are so incredibly genius, and I just don't understand. Like, I know a lot of people say that Ferrante's books are semi-autobiographical. It's so specific that it has to be biographical, but at the same time, it's so well crafted that even if it all was true, you have to give Ferrante her flowers for being able to write it in the way that she writes it. I'm not the first, nor will I be the last, to sing praises of Elena Ferrante's books, and to be a little more specific about the 3 books that I read this year: Story of the Lost Child, Story of a New Name, The Ones Who Stay and The Ones Who Leave. I think my favorite of those 3 was the last book, because again, the conclusion, knowing the whole story, or at least the story up until this point, because Elena Ferrante is still alive, and if she is indeed the Elena who is in these books, her story isn't over, but in a certain way it is over. I don't know if that makes sense. Reading that conclusion, I think it's such a good ending, and it just is, I don't know, I don't have the words to describe how good these books are. I just think you should all read them, and if you read My Brilliant Friend and you're like, I like this, I don't see why it's so good, you should read the rest of the series, because it builds and becomes this huge, beautiful, real life. Continuing on with our wonderful and light theme of women, violence, and disappearing, I have the book The God Is Not Willing by Steven Erikson. This is a book that is about the cycles of violence, breaking those cycles, and the pain of breaking those cycles. It is a beautiful, beautiful book, one that I cannot talk about a lot because it also happens to be like the 11th book in a series. I love this book, and it's now my favorite book of the Malazan world that I've read so far, and pretty much all of the books that I've talked about so far would be on my favorites of all time list. I also did read the follow-up to The God Is Not Willing, No Life Forsaken. That one I liked and loved, but I don't think I loved it quite as much as I loved The God Is Not Willing. Not as emotional of a story, and I don't think Erikson was trying to write as emotional of a story. It is a lot more lighthearted and still, goes to some very dark places. No Life Forsaken does, but The God Is Not Willing is just a masterpiece in my mind, and it is a perfect novel. It's amazing. Breasts and Eggs by Mieko Kawakami is a more modern, set in Japan. It is about a writer and her sister in the first part comes to visit her. She has this really sort of, maybe not strained relationship, but they just have a lot of shared history coming from a childhood that was really difficult. A single mother who decided to leave their father and supported her 2 children by herself. They lived in a lot of poverty growing up because of that, but her sister's coming to visit her. They're all adults now, and it's really interesting when her sister shows up and she's telling her that she wants to get a breast augmentation. And there's this sort of incredulity that the main character meets this with, because they're not rich, like they don't have a lot of money, and her sister has a daughter of her own as well. There's this sort of question of like, why are you spending so much money on this surgery when you have a daughter? Like, you don't barely even have any money to begin with. I think that this book just spoke to the general weirdness of modern day society when it comes to not just women, I think anyone. When you have these cosmetic procedures that are so invasive, and like it's just this cognitive dissonance that everyone walks around with when you see someone in a magazine whose face is completely artificial, and like that strangeness and that uncanniness. I think that this book captures that really well, and that pressure to not age and that motivation that people have to get plastic surgery. I think that this book explores that in a really kind way. It's not trying to be like one way or the other. It's not completely pro plastic surgery and it's not completely against it, but it just explores that gray area, that sort of clang of dissonance that you feel when you learn about these things. Part 1, breasts, and then part 2, eggs, is about the main character herself as she realizes that she wants to have children, but she's not currently in a relationship, and she doesn't, she's not dating anyone, and realizes that she wants to be a mother. And so she starts to research sperm donors. And again, I think that is another area of modern day life that is so strange and has never existed before, where you can just as a single woman get a sperm donor, not know the identity of your father, and like just the procedure of doing that, like it's so different to what we have experienced in the past, like 50 years ago. I don't know if they had sperm donors 50 years ago, but like 100 years ago, that's not something that would be possible for anyone. And now that is an avenue that exists to become a parent. The author also goes into the children who are born of these sperm donors and how they feel about not knowing their fathers, and just all of the strangeness that comes with modern life, combined with just this really beautiful story of the main character who is intensely lonely. She's a writer. On the social level, there's a lot of social commentary happening in this book, and then on the individual level, it is just the story of this woman who is intensely lonely, going through the motions of life, and like she goes on lunch dates with her friends, and there's so much interesting stuff happening on those lunch dates when she goes just to eat food with her other friends who are women. Like those conversations, I think, are such a reflection of conversations I've had with my own friends. Yeah, I found it to be a really, really fantastic book. There's no plot. It's just this woman's life dealing with the modern day maze of the world. I do have to mention Small Things Like These by Claire Keegan. This is such a short slip of a book, but it falls perfectly into women, violence, and disappearing. And it was just a really incredible book that I read in January of last year. It's so short that I really can't say much about it. It deals with the Irish Catholic laundries, a piece of history that I didn't know about. And I think in terms of it being just an educational short story, it was fantastic. But Keegan's writing and her ability to sketch out this beautiful emotional life for the main character of that little short story is incredible. This was my second Claire Keegan. I also read Foster in 2024, and I will continue to read more of her little books because they just continue to be emotional gut punches that teach me something about Ireland, which is a part of the world that I don't know much about. So I enjoy learning, but also going through this emotional roller coaster of a journey that she takes you on in such a short amount of space. Drive Your Plow Over the Bones of the Dead by Olga Tokarczuk, another book that is about women, about violence, about disappearing. And I think that this book is about disappearing in the sense that women who are older really tend to disappear in society. That is one way that you could look at this. The main character, it really breaks my heart how people treat her because she is so intelligent. She is a very wise person, and yet no one listens to her, and she is completely ignored by so many people. And yet she does have this really core group of friends, and she has her own community and her own way of living that she's carved out. I adored this book, and I want to read more Olga Tokarczuk. I think that Drive Your Plow is really fantastic as well for its inclusion of astrology. I think that people think of astrology, like the way that people think of astrology is such an interesting litmus test for their personality and cultural background. And I grew up sort of having astrology within my culture. Like, I don't personally believe in astrology that much, but it is a cultural thing. And I think that astrology is really interesting from the perspective of it tells you something about yourself, and whether or not you agree with it or you don't agree with it, it gives you some form of self-knowledge, and that is valuable. Whether or not you align with it is telling you something. I just really love the inclusion of astrology in this book, and I find it to be so just fantastic because it does set certain people on a path to viewing this character in the light of she's frivolous, she is not intelligent, she's not grounded in logic. And then as you learn more about the main character, you realize that she is necessarily all of those things. She is necessarily a logical person. She's necessarily very, very intelligent. And just the different layers to her and the way that people treat her, I just loved reading about it. I found it to be a very darkly humorous book, and personally I probably thought it was more humorous than the author was going for. I thought it was really lighthearted personally, but then when I was listening to Olga Tokarczuk talk about it, she was saying that when she finished writing it, she like just cried and broke down. And I was like, wow, that's really interesting, because I thought it was a little bit more lighthearted than that. But then when I think about it, it is a really, really heavy book. So that makes sense. And it makes me angry the way that people treat the main character. It makes me angry because I realize that one day I'm going to be a middle-aged woman, or even older than that, hopefully. And that is such a privilege to grow old, and yet we treat older women with such disdain. And yeah, I don't know. I really love this book, and I think it fits into my umbrella theme. I have one last book that fits into our broad category of women, violence, and disappearing, and that is Ammonite by Nicola Griffith. This is a book that I gave 3 stars when I first read it. I didn't love it, but it's a book that has really stayed with me. It's a book about a planet where only women can exist. There's some weird disease that kills men when they come onto the planet, and does not affect women for whatever reason. And over millions of years, they have developed ways to procreate with other women. I think that Griffith actually takes a really balanced approach to writing this, and it's not depicted as some kind of utopia. There is still violence, there is still war, there is still conflict, and there is still evil that exists among this society. Just a really sort of interesting book from an anthropological point of view. This is sort of the point in the list where I'm talking about books that aren't necessarily like my favorite of all time. They're just like books that I really liked that I read last year. I'm very curious to read more of Nicola Griffith's stuff. I own Hild. I think that's the only one I own. I do have 2 books that I wanted to talk about that don't necessarily fall into this bucket of women, violence, and disappearing. Those are Demon Copperhead by Barbara Kingsolver. This one, the Pulitzer Prize coming-of-age story, deals with addiction, the cycle of addiction in his life, set in the Appalachian region in the United States, and it was just a really harrowing read. I think of it as a companion read to Empire of Pain. I've talked about it a lot on this channel before, so I won't go too in-depth into it, but I did want to mention Demon Copperhead as one of my favorite books that I read last year. And then, again, New York 2140 by Kim Stanley Robinson depicts a future where New York is flooded and people live in these super scrapers that are constantly in danger of being flooded themselves. And it is just a fantastic climate fiction novel that speaks to hope and is really realistic, and is a book about community and the importance of community. I think I have talked myself out of brain cells as this video went on, so if I got less and less eloquent as time went on. I apologize, but please let me know again in the comments down below what your favorite books of 2025 were. So excited to be back to YouTube. Thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you in the next video. Until then, take care.